Welcome to a series that we call The End of Times, where we're going through the book of Revelation, verse by verse, to do our best to look for the signs and the seasons of God's second coming. It's very important that we take some time to look for these signs and to see what it is we can expect to happen and what it is we can expect that we should be doing during that time. And as we've gone through the book of Revelation, we have gone through the seven seals, reading the scroll that was in God's hand that John saw in heaven, and we finally get to the seventh trumpet, Jesus Christ's second coming in chapter 11. But yet there's a pause in the story, and then we're kind of exposed to this, well, why are these things happening? Why are these things happening? And it's in chapter 12 that John then sees a great sign in heaven, and we've spent the last several episodes on that. So we're just going to pick it up where we left off, where what he saw was a woman in the stars, and we determined that is Israel. And then he saw the dragon, which is Satan, trying to prevent the woman from giving birth to the child, to God, to giving birth to Jesus Christ. And then finally he then tries to devour her offspring until the very end, and that's where we're at right now. So really what we got in chapter 12 verses 1 through 6 is really the history of all of humanity in just six verses, the spiritual side of things. God declared that Jesus Christ would redeem mankind to Adam and Eve and Satan, and then since then he's been trying to stop it, but then Jesus Christ came and redeemed mankind, and now that he's short on time, he's there to declare himself to be God, and that's kind of where we're at now. We're going to pick it up in verse 6, or verse 5. And she bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. That's where we left off last time. Verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now this is a peculiar verse. Essentially what it's saying is Israel then fled into the wilderness where God prepared a place for them for 1,260 days. So we're talking about the end time. So, at the very beginning of this chapter, we were talking about Adam and Eve, and it made it all the way now to the end times in 6 verses. That's what that is. And again, go back, watch those other episodes that'll explain that better. I don't want to kind of go through that again, because there's so much in this verse that we got to get out of this, because what we're looking at is essentially the 1,260 days was the amount of time determined that the 144,000 Israelites and the Christian Gentiles will be prophesying for. We can see this in the first half of chapter 7, where these 144,000 Israelites are marked by God, and then the second half of chapter 7 is the multitude of Gentile Christians being slaughtered by the Antichrist. Chapter 9, verse 4, when the wasps are set free from the bottomless pit to sting and cause so much pain to humans that they want to die, God says to harm everyone but those marked by God. And then it is in chapter 14 that we get a much better grasp of who those 144,000 are and what it is they are to do. We haven't gotten to chapter 14, so we're going to kind of come back to that. But ultimately what you have going on here is you have 144,000 Israelites marked by God. The moment that the Antichrist causes the abomination of desolation to take place, then according to what we read back in chapter 11 was then there's 1,260 days. So there's this wilderness place that has been set up for the Israelites to flee to, because they're going to need to flee. It's once Antichrist stands in the temple and declares himself to be God, it is not a good day. And we've talked about that for several episodes. That is not a good day for the Israelites. It's not a good day for the worldwide. It's a good day for those worshiping the Antichrist, but for everybody else that realizes that that is actually Satan, it's a bad day. So we're going to kind of dig into what is this place in the wilderness and why did he prepare this place for them. So again, when we get to chapter 14, we'll talk more about who those 144,000 Israelites are. But we're going to spend this episode mostly focusing on Israel, the woman who then, once the abomination takes place, then they have to flee. Where are they to go? Now, if we go back to chapter 11 for a second, in Revelation, in chapter 11, verse 3, it says, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." So that's the same amount of time. So we're looking at this 1,260 days from the abomination to this place where the Israelites have to flee to the wilderness, but they're warring with the Antichrist and prophesying Jesus Christ as the king and not the Antichrist as the king. So this is a war that the Antichrist is very interested in. But Jesus talks specifically about this moment in time in Matthew 24. If we take a look at Matthew 24, what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 is his second coming. The disciples ask, well, how will we know? And he gets into, well, how you'll know. But there's a peculiar thing that he says starting in verse 14. "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So there's the preaching and the witnessing. Then we'll pick it up in 15. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." That's a very peculiar thing. So we're going to come back to this. Keep that abomination of desolation in your head. We're going to come back to that. But once you see that, then let those who are in Judea, that's where Jerusalem is, where the temple will be, flee to the mountains. Let him who is on his housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those with nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. So ultimately what Jesus is saying is that the moment you see the abomination of desolation, those of you in Judea and Jerusalem, that moment, don't even take time to go get your clothes. Flee. That is it, because slaughter is coming. Once you see that happen, it is time to flee. Now, the interesting thing, and I said let's go back to it, is in Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." It's very important we do understand what he's talking about. Now, what he's talking about is in Daniel, and we brought this verse up in the past, but in Daniel 12, at the very end of Daniel 12, he talks about this, or an angel tells Daniel about this. We'll read Daniel 12, chapter 10. "Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly." So they're talking about there's going to be a heavy persecution of Christians. Many Christians will be standing up for Jesus Christ, be made white, but the wicked will do wickedly. "And none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." So the wicked will be worshiping the Antichrist, saying he is Christ. They're not going to understand any of this, but the wise will understand. Pick it up in 11. "And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away," there's the abomination, "and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. So here, what we see in Revelation is from the abomination that there'll be this safety place, some sort of place prepared, the wilderness, and we'll kind of come back to where that is here in a second, prepared for the Jews. Now, of course, this is worldwide. So there's Christians all over the world being persecuted by a worldwide leader and his worldwide army. Worship him, take the mark of the beast, and we'll get into what that is a little later, and or die. And that's kind of where we're at. So ultimately what's taking place is there'll be this 1,260 days where the Christians are actually putting up a darn good fight, really holding their own. God is protecting them. They're empowered with great powers. Go back to chapter 11 episodes to see what those powers are. And so they're really kind of whooping up on the Antichrist a little bit, prophesying, driving everybody crazy. But then after 1,260 days, they are killed, like we saw in chapter 11. And then now, according to Daniel, there's an additional 30 days until we see the coming of Christ. So what we're seeing here is, again, at the abomination, essentially flee at that very moment. The devil has taken his throne in the temple of God. This is not a good day for all of humanity. It's the worst day in all of humanity. There's slaughter of Jews and Christians, and it's really the only war of all the wars leading up to this that even matters at all, because it's a war between the Antichrist and the world and the remnant of Jesus Christ. And this will go on for 1,260 days worldwide. But this passage is about Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is ground zero for the battle of the kingdom of God on earth as it is heaven. And that's why we're even looking at these things. Now, so going back to Revelation, is then the woman fled into the wilderness. So the woman is Israel. So Israel flees to the wilderness, just like Jesus said to do in Matthew 24. And where she has a place prepared by God. So God has prepared a place for Israel in the wilderness somewhere, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Well, where is this place? I mean, if I was in Israel, I'd like to know where this place is. So Daniel tells us, and it's really kind of interesting. I don't know if anybody else has ever pointed this out in relation to Revelation 11 or Revelation 12, saying, well, that God has prepared a place. But in Daniel 11, it's really interesting. There's warnings between the king of the north and the south. Now, what they're talking about is they're essentially talking about warnings between the king north of Israel and the king south of Israel. And they go through the history of Greek, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, the Romans. I mean, it just goes through goes through so many different kings north of Israel and south of Israel. And the reason that's so important is because the battleground is Israel. And it goes from essentially the Greeks all the way to the end times, battling of these kings between the north and the south. And we see a very peculiar verse in 1140. So we're going to take a look at Daniel 1140. At the time of the end, so that's the time we're talking about, the king of the south shall attack him, meaning the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Now we know that the Antichrist is coming from the north. And again, go back, I think it was episode 3 that we talked about that he'll be coming from the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land. So he's saying now he's conquering Israel here. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So ultimately what it's saying is the Antichrist will come from the north and he'll just sweep through. He'll just sweep through, taking everybody all the way down through Egypt easily. But Edom, Moab, and Ammon, he won't be able to take. God's going to kind of guard those little areas. Well, if you kind of look at this map here, Edom, Moab, the kingdom of Edom, Moab, and Ammon are east of the Jordan River. And if you look at today's map, well, we're talking about Jordan, the nation of Jordan. So now again, this verse, this little tiny verse says so much. Let's kind of, after everything we've just talked about, let's go back to it and kind of wrap this up. So Revelation 12, verse 6, then the woman, Israel, fled into the wilderness, Jordan, where she has a place prepared by God. Then they should feed her there 1,260 days. During that time is the most important war that has ever taken place on the earth. It is the war for all of humanity. It is the warring of the kingdom of heaven on earth, just like it is in heaven, because it is going to be like heaven here. And the devil's doing everything he can to stop it. So he tries to devour the woman, knowing that the woman bears the redemption of mankind. And then she gives birth to a child, Jesus Christ, and he redeems mankind. But he wants to devour that. From the moment that even Jesus was conceived in Mary, he's been trying to kill him. And then when he couldn't achieve it, and even when he did kill him, Jesus robbed the grave. And so now he's just been trying to devour Israel ever since, through disbanding them, and all the way when they came back to then World War II. And it's just been this constant state of trying to devour the nation of Israel. And now the Antichrist is then going to sit on the throne of God in the temple of God, declare himself to be God. And at that moment, Israel needs to flee to Jordan and just stay there and wage war from there for 1,260 and 60 days. Now this war will be a worldwide war, because of course at some point we're going to see the destruction of Babylon, which is a third of the earth, but other than that, it's worldwide. So that's kind of, it's a lot in a little tiny verse. I hope it made sense. I was doing my best to kind of grab verses to try to tie it all together, because again, we only use the Bible as a reference, so I definitely want to use the Bible as a reference. So love to hear your thoughts on this. Put them in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support our channel to Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.